Welcome. This is Gary Miranda, and over the course of this podcast series, I'm going to be sharing some poems, mostly my own, though I also reserve the right to read some of my favorite poems by other poets. For this first session, I'd like to share some poems that I almost always read when I give a reading. Deciding what to read at a reading isn't easy. The poems start stomping their little metrical feet and shouting, "Choose me, choose me." There are some poems, even some that might be among my favorites, that I almost never read at a reading simply because they're too long or perhaps too difficult to absorb on a first hearing. But the poems I'm going to read today are what you might call my first stringers, the starting five. I know that, however lame my self-deprecating remarks in between poems might be, these poems will rise to the occasion and get the job done. The first of these is called The One That Got Away. This poem was a favorite of the late William Meredith, a wonderful poet, who was once the judge of a poetry contest I'd entered. My manuscript didn't win the contest, but Meredith took the trouble to write and tell me how much he liked this poem. For the same reason, when he was later Poet Laureate of the United States, he invited me to read my poems at the Library of Congress. Anyway, not only do I always include this poem at readings, but I always read it first, since I've learned that the captive audiences tend to identify with the little black boy in the poem. The One That Got Away. "Man, you got a bird where your brain should be," he says, talking to me. I say, "Perhaps you'd like to explain that figure of speech for the whole class." He says, "A bird, man, a bird, that's one of them things with wings, what flies around. You just sits on your ass, but your brain, it flies around, goes flap and flap, like this." He shows me then with his arms, doing flap and flaps between the aisles, like a trained crow's bad imitation of a little black boy flying. Then he flaps to the back of the room and out the door, free. Free of the class that doesn't crack a smile. Free of the teacher who sits on his ass, a bird where his brain should be. This next poem, which is called Like Snow, has a rather interesting story connected with it. One day while my wife and I were taking our son Nicholas back to Whitman College, we were driving up the Columbia Gorge listening to Garrison Keillor on Prairie Home Companion. It was April, which is National Poetry Month, and Garrison was asking people in the audience to stand up and recite poems that they knew by heart. So someone stood up and recited Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost, and someone else stood up and recited The Lake Isle of Innisfree by Yeats. And then a woman stood up and said, "I'd like to recite a poem by Gary Miranda." Well, I just about drove off the highway. I did, in fact, pull off the highway and listened to the woman recite perfectly my poem, Like Snow. I was never able to find out the woman's name to thank her, but I can tell you this, winning awards and getting good reviews are fine, but when someone cares enough about one of your poems, not only to memorize it, but to stand up and recite it on National Public Radio, well, it doesn't get any better than that. Like Snow. Some people would remember iron railings, the color of buildings, how a dog circled 3 times before settling in. Novelists, certainly, or just good talkers. Most of us take only the light from a place and translate even that into the way our spirits shape the light. We flash into knowledge, which, if we ignore it, will not forgive us. Objects can survive fine on their own, but the feel for how this face, that window, falls upon the momentary way we hold ourselves could easily get lost, and who would find it? Such loss, if lived with, stiffens into pain. It stands up, starched and handsome, ready to please the neighbors. We find ourselves forgetting dreams, whole days, the last time we were honest. We ask ourselves, say something in childhood, and feel only the weight of what that means brush against our face like snow. Like snow, we say, not even coming close. This next poem is called Magician, and is not to be confused with another poem of mine called The Magician. I have a gift for titles. When I was a kid, I spent many hours practicing sleight of hand magic with cards in front of mirrors. I suspect that this has carried over into how I like to use rhyme in some of my poems. The rhymes help the poems work, but I don't want the audience to be aware of them. This particular poem, which ironically doesn't have a rhyme, was first published in Northwest Review, when that magazine was edited by David Wagner. I had been sending Wagner poems for years, partly because I admired his poetry, and partly because Northwest Review was out of Seattle, and I grew up in Seattle. In any case, I'd been getting nothing but gentle rejections from Wagner for all those years when I happened to discover that he was a bona fide magician, actually belonged to a magician's union. So I sent him this poem along with 4 or 5 others, and he accepted it, even though it was no better or worse than all the other poems of mine he'd seen over the years. Let this be an object lesson for any aspiring poets out there. The reason poems are accepted or rejected often has little to do with the quality of the poems. Magician. What matters more than practice is the fact that you, my audience, are pulling for me, want me to pull it off, this next sleight. Now you see it. Something more than whether I succeed's at stake. This talk is called patter. This is misdirection, how my left hand shows you nothing's in it. Nothing is. I count on your mistake of caring. In my right hand, you're undoing blooms like cancer. But I've shown you that already, empty. Most tricks are done before you think they've started, you who value space more than time. The balls, the cards, the coins, they go into the past, not into my pocket. If I give you anything, be sure it's not important. What I keep keeps me alive, a truth on which your interest hinges. We are like lovers, if you will. Sometimes, even if you don't will. Now you don't. This next poem is unique in that it's the only poem for which I've ever received hate mail. It was published in The Atlantic, which at the time was called the Atlantic Monthly, and about a week after it appeared, I received a forwarded letter that was postmarked New York but had no return address and was not signed. The poem, which is called The News from Moons, opens with the lines, "Jupiter has 11 or 9, I don't know which." The letter opened with, "If you didn't know how many moons Jupiter had, you should have looked it up at the encyclopedia. This would have saved you at least 2 lines of drivel." The irony here is that on that very same day, the Boston Globe ran an article noting that a new moon had just been discovered on Jupiter. So had I relied on the encyclopedia, I would have been wrong. That's called poetic justice. The news from moons. Jupiter has 11 or 9, I don't know which, or whether they resemble ours or even each other. A moon is a moon. Perhaps. But science aside, we shouldn't underestimate the mystique an eye lends to any landscape, mistaken or not. And the eye is connected somewhere, just as the ear, caressed, has lines like a telegraph to the shuddering loins. Except the eye's connection is less predictable, more varied, and to a place not charted on anatomical maps. I have seen maps of the moon even, ours I mean, where every bump and indentation's labeled. Grimaldi, Landsberg, Rabbi Levy, names no moon would think of giving its children. What we call a thing should matter. A moon would come, called by its true name. It's when the eye beckons from that place, here moon, though not in so many words. A moon has as many names as the eye can give it, and knows them all, and can't be fooled. Moonogamy is fine, but think if we had 9 or 11 moons flashing their bright news, like plankton when you splash in the sea at night, or a good day on Wall Street. Such a cache of news, each eye would need a college education and have to specialize. On second thought, I think I'll take our one the way it is, that flat white stone in the sky. Skip it. The final of my starting 5, perhaps even the captain of the team, is called Horse Chestnut. At the time the poem was written, I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in an apartment on Oxford Street, very near Harvard Yard. I'd been living there for about a year before I happened to notice one day that just outside my window there was a horse chestnut tree. Now, as will become clear from the poem, horse chestnut trees loom large in my personal mythology, and when I saw the tree, I started writing down as quickly as I could all the associations that came rushing back, without any concern for order or effect. This poem was the result. It also originally appeared in The Atlantic and has a story connected with it, but the poem itself tells a story, so I needn't comment further. Horse chestnut. I fell from one once. Judy Cole used to put 5 of them whole in her mouth. My brothers ran to tell my mother, "It's Gary. He fell from a tree, but he isn't dead yet." As I write, there's one outside my window. I have a weakness still for women with large mouths. The doctor put 2 fingers into my head, tingly with Novocaine, and said to my mother, "Look, you can see where the skull is chipped." Sometimes we made pipes or necklaces. My mother groaned and looked away. I can never figure out what connection they had with horses. Later, Judy Cole was named Miss Seattle. Mostly what I remember is blood all around and me lying there thinking, so this is dying. Every one of them has 2 inside, like testicles. I wasn't afraid, really, just convinced. By the time I began to think I loved her, we had been children too long together for it to matter. 16 stitches. I saw her once later when she was married. My mother said, "I don't want to see you near that tree again, understand?" I still tend to confuse dying and love, and no one I've ever loved has died exactly. Thank you for listening. Until next time, this is Gary Miranda saying with Theodore Rethke, wake the happy words.